So my name is Walter Long, and I'm a criminal defense attorney, among other things, and have practiced death penalty habeas law for about a quarter century here in Texas, ever since law school, back in the mid-1990s. And I was asked to, the question that I was presented for the workshop tonight was, what in my spiritual life led me to work with others against the death penalty? So I'm going to roll through the spiritual life stuff here at the outset, and then would love to hear others' comments on their own spiritual lives and how those are related to how they relate to the death penalty. And I'm going to just pass over a whole lot of stuff here in the opening remarks. I'm sure leaving a lot of gaps that may get filled in or not later on in the conversation. Be interested to hear if any of you hear parallels in your own lives to mine, and be interested to hear the differences, even differences of opinion on the subject matter. So my spiritual life, I suppose, started when I was a kid and in a Presbyterian family in Austin. I'm a fourth generation Texan. I had then, as I was growing up in high school, had the beginning of a flirtation with the evangelical movement, which led me to go to an evangelical seminary after I graduated with a history degree from the University of Texas. It's there in the Evangelical Seminary that I ironically encountered feminism. The seminary was a Calvinist school, taught Calvinist theology, predestination, God in control of history, God in control of even the minutest detail of one's life, a Father God, an all-powerful being with whom one brooks no dissent without being in sin and punishable. What happened when I went to seminary was I ended up getting a 2-year master's degree in religion. I immediately felt a disjoint between things that felt right to me and what was there. One of the most interesting stresses was that women had just been, this is 1976, and women had just been allowed into the seminary to be students. Before that, it had been an all-male institution. And that was because seminaries back then were primarily designed to feed pastorates. And at the time, there were very few women pastors in any denomination, but actually zero, in the denominations that sent students to the seminary. And so what happened to me was that I sort of experienced the experience of my fellow women students while I was there. Who kind of suffered under this patriarchal structure, weren't treated equally in class, were mansplained a whole lot. And the word mansplaining, the idea, concept didn't exist at the time, but in retrospect, that's what was going on. Things were so bad that, the few women that went there earnestly wanting to study theology sort of became targets for the male students, because the male students had to go out into this all-male employment world where they were sort of considered suspect if they didn't have a wife. They were considered a risk to the single female and the married female parishioners if they weren't married. So in order to get a good job offer on graduating seminary, they needed to be married, which then sort of put a target on the head of all the women that went there. And one of the most astounding things I saw was my roommate and one of his best friends fighting each other in the seminary library over a woman who barely knew either one of them, but was the object of both of their affections and whom they both believed would be a perfect wife. So this is where I discovered feminism, because I felt the oppression that my female colleagues were going through. And so every year since then, the school still does not offer all educational programs to women students that it offers to male students because of the pastoral thing. They still don't, the churches that send people there still don't recognize women pastors, at least not having any authority over men in a church in a spiritual sense. So every so often, I'll take one of the annual funding letters and I'll reply to it and I'll say, my theology is way past where it was then. So I wouldn't fund you anyway, admitted, but I certainly wouldn't until you provide an equal opportunity, the same opportunity to your female students that you provide your male students. Interestingly, there's a professor, I think she's at Stanford, named Lynn Hunt, who wrote a book called Inventing Human Rights, where she analyzes how human rights arose during the Enlightenment period and points to the rise of the novel and how the original novels, many of them involved explorations of the inner lives of women and kind of a revealing of their emotional lives. And she said it's sort of this combination of the recognition that the novel gave to the independent bodies that we all have, and the interior lives that laid some groundwork for the invention of the modern human rights regime. And that's kind of what I experienced was, having some empathy for what my fellow students who were female were going through. And so when I left the seminary, this challenged the whole structure in my mind, and I was spinning. A couple of inspirations after seminary, I read Kierkegaard, and I really think I benefited from his analysis of the human situation as having different stages or aspects: aesthetic stage, moral stage, spiritual stage. In particular, I was fascinated by this idea of entry into time through commitment to others. And it's that attachment, that commitment, the decision to form a long-standing relationship with another person in the course of all the vicissitudes of time and life in the world. That is what he characterized as a fundamentally moral stage of existence. I found that to be helpful. I also was inspired by Martin Buber and Martin Buber's writing about dialogue and his understanding of power and how in each moment we're presented with a choice to either treat another as a person, as another, as someone whose separate life and dignity should be respected equally with our own, or to use them in some way. And this is a powerful insight. I found Buber really helpful, and I think that Buber later was very commensurate with Quaker theology. And it was me moving toward Quaker faith and the idea of respecting that of God and all others. So in the 1990s, I participated in the sanctuary movement in a way. I was involved in a small Christian community that itself decided to do the overground railroad rather than the underground railroad during the original sanctuary movement. So we helped a lot of refugees who were in detention find money to get out and on to other places to live, and many of them I helped to go to Canada. I sort of became my own NGO, and I found refugees who were in detention, Salvadorans and Guatemalans mostly, who were fleeing the hot wars in Central America. And through the Dallas Canadian Consulate, I helped them to apply to Canada for landed immigrant status, permanent residence in Canada. And so this work, brought me to the Friends meeting, because the Austin Friends meeting was the only sanctuary church in Austin, the only religious congregation that declared sanctuary in Austin in the original sanctuary movement. And there were refugees housed in the old meeting house on Washington Square. And I went over there and helped them apply to go to Canada. And so that brought me into the meeting. And I think also during this time of the 1990s, just my continued engagement of the world, perhaps inspired by Kierkegaard's, encouragement to take the moral step in committing oneself to others in the world in order to enter into time, in his way of putting it. I got very involved with refugees. Some of this sent me to Central America on occasion, and I had a lot of experiences that sort of pretty much put an end to sort of any, I'd say in retrospect, put an end to beliefs that God was sort of in control of history, this Calvinist thing that was still dangling there in the background of my mind. One experience was like being on the streets of El Salvador, trying to help a family leave the country, streets in San Salvador. And we were driving along I was with the husband of a family of 5 in a taxi cab. We were driving along, trying to wrap up some last minute things that he needed to do before we all left the country on a bus to go to Guatemala. And a bomb went off about 40 feet from our car. It was a guerrilla bomb attached to a telephone pole, which was a very common thing back in those days. Broke the pole in half, and it sent splinters and dust and stuff through the air that caught the eyes of a child that happened to be, unfortunately, between us and the pole and looking in its direction. And the child turned around and he had blood coming down from both eyes. He ultimately lost one eye. Our car, we were knocked over by the blast in our seats. We sat back up, saw the child, brought him over to the car, asked him to get in, and he got in. And then we were talking to all the people that came running from all sorts of places around, saying, where are his parents, and who knows this child? And finally, and the people that were coming up thought maybe we did the bomb, and ultimately an aunt showed up. We took him to the Red Cross, and I followed up years after that, trying to help him, as he had lost one of his eyes. He needed to have a false eye, on one side, and his eyesight was damaged in the other. And this sort of thing is not something that happens in a just universe. So, I think it's encounter with the world sort of damps down, the urge to think that there's some kind of being that has asserted control over the whole. I wanted to read, I guess, just a quick. This is a book called Suffering by Dorothy Sirla. She was a German theologian, feminist theologian, and she addressed the Calvinist God as what she described as a God behind a sadistic theology and masochistic. And she talks about Kierkegaard in this book and his dealing with the story of Abraham and Isaac, which he does, and I think it's Fear and Trembling is the work in which he talks about that. And he talks about, sort of the leap of faith, because what God asked Abraham to do, which is to sacrifice his son, is illogical and irrational. But Kierkegaard works with that to call that, stepping into faith. But she doesn't look at it that way. Sirla just sort of talks about that as sort of a foundation for theology that got all the more sadistic when the Christian community adopted that story as the background for the God that actually sacrifices his son, completes the act. And so here's what she says at the end of this really pretty amazing chapter in the book Suffering, which is entitled "The Critique of Christian Masochism." She says, in a theology of this kind, the story of Abraham serves as a preliminary stage which has not yet reached the full severity. Only on Golgotha does Moriah find fulfillment. Only there does God strike the final blow. The comparatively weak expression of Paul's that God did not spare his own son, but offered him up, is now taken to its logical conclusion, namely annihilation. Who wants such a God? Who gains anything from him? What kind of people must those be whose highest being seeks his honor in practicing retaliation in a ratio of 1 to 100? Why in such a theology should Jesus suffer, quote, at God's hands? Did the victims at Auschwitz die at God's hands and not because of Cyclone Beta, which the IG Farben company manufactured for a few cents a dose? Was he on the side of the executioner or still on the side of the dying? When you look at human suffering concretely, you destroy all innocence, all neutrality, every attempt to say, wasn't I, there was nothing I could do, I didn't know. In the face of suffering, you're either with the victim or the executioner. There's no other option. Therefore, that explanation of suffering that looks away from the victim and identifies itself with the righteousness that is supposed to stand behind the suffering has already taken a step in the direction of theological sadism, which wants to understand God as the torturer. So, around this time, or the early 1990s, I was beginning to see things this way. I was beginning to agree with, very much be attracted to Albert Camus' idea of the rebel, that humans are fundamentally aligned with each other against death, and his aspirational maxim, neither victims nor executioners, as being, the goal that we should be seeking for a thriving human community. So I went to law school because my wife said, I've been doing all this work with refugees. I was acting like a lawyer, we might as well make some money at it. And, I wanted to be a human rights lawyer. And it was in my constitutional law class, second semester, first year. It met in a large auditorium, kind of with steep stairs that went down to a podium at the front with several hundred students in it at a time. And it was taught by a young professor who had just clerked for Justice Thurgood Marshall in the US Supreme Court. Was very shy and retiring. And so it was really extraordinary when one day he burst into the class, the top of the classroom, ran down the steps, went up to the podium, and for about 15 minutes just launched into this long, complicated story about the night before, when Texas conducted its executions between 12 midnight and 6 a.m., like well before midnight. They'd been achieving stays in one court and having another superior court lift them. And then on after midnight, this battle for getting a solid stay of execution in this case that lasted till about 4 or 5 in the morning, when finally the last court to grant a stay was the US Supreme Court, a stay that could not be lifted by any other court. And the issue that they were seeking a stay on was the legal question: would the US Constitution permit the execution of someone who was actually factually innocent of the crime? And that may sound absurd. Like, why would you even ask that question? I mean, surely, a rational constitution would prohibit the execution of somebody who was factually innocent. Not there, not involved in any way with what happened, what they would be being punished for. But in fact, in that case, the US Supreme Court didn't answer the question. It decided that the guy that brought the case to it was probably guilty, and so it decided to leave the question open. And it never has answered that question. But I was hooked. The craziness of that brought home, brought my concern for human rights home. And so thereafter, I got a job with a federal public defender out of law school that worked with death row inmates. And when that office closed, worked in private practice until now, representing inmates under sentence of death in Texas. The Friends Meeting of Austin has been a sanctuary for me. It's been a place where there hasn't been any sort of question about whether the death penalty is moral or right, good, legal thing. When I was attending other churches, my wife attends other churches, Episcopal, Catholic, and I was somewhat always treated like an oddity in those places. Like, oh my goodness, you're fighting the death penalty. You're fighting for people who are sentenced to die. That, I was treated as though with some, like, instead of like encouragement, like with pity, with surprise. And, that wasn't spiritually helpful to me. Whereas the meeting has been an amazing spiritual backdrop and support and community. And just tonight, or this afternoon, when I was getting ready for this, I discovered in a online, still exists, from the year 2000, it's a human rights advocates organization out in California. This is their newsletter from winter of 2000, and in it they printed our entire lengthy declaration of sanctuary for juvenile death row inmates that the Friends Meeting of Austin issued. It's headed up by the Death Penalty Subcommittee of the Ad Hoc Peace and Social Concerns Committee of the Friends Meeting of Austin, and it's a joint public sanctuary for juveniles. And I'll just read the beginning of the conclusion of it here. Conclusion: the current system of justice, which we have in Texas, based upon abstract retribution, discourages even minimal healing of the breach caused by a violent offense. The system vigorously pursues the death of the defendant, producing dramatic collateral damage, often overwhelming aggrieved survivors of the victim, ostracizing the family of the defendant, and placing enormous stress upon the emotional and physical well-being of those entrusted to carry out the state's violent policies. We hope that in contrast, the Joint Declaration of Sanctuary will provide a window on our violence, allowing our authorities to take measures to bring about constructive change. And then we proceed. The Declaration of Sanctuary was actually a request that everybody boycott the Texas tourism industry. And it sort of closes out with that request. One of the things that's remarkable about this document, what I just read, is it sort of presages what I did later, which is in 2007, I started the Texas After Violence Project, which is an oral history project about the death penalty and state violence, basically about our retributive justice system, and receive stories from persons who have been affected by that and whatever position they may hold in relation to that system. And that was inspired by, among other things, the Quaker-led movement to abolish slavery in the British Empire. And there was a guy who was actually an Episcopal minister, I think, named Thomas Clarkson, who rode across England carrying the implements of slavery in his saddlebags, the chains, manacles, from slave ships that made the Atlantic Passage to the West Indies to show Britons what life was like for those slaves that had been sent to be forced to work on their plantations growing their sugar. And he did that for like 30 years, crisscrossing England, showing people the evidence. Well, so the Texas After Bonds Project grew out of this awareness that was growing in me and all the folks around me of the damage that our death penalty system was doing to everybody in the system, not just defendants and not just their families, but judges, prosecutors, jurors, guards, wardens, chaplains, everyone in the system. And so, yeah, I would say that, that project has been an outgrowth of my Quaker background as it was growing. And another thing that we started doing, I think before the US Supreme Court actually ruled that the juvenile death penalty was unconstitutional in 2005, somewhere around that time, or maybe right before that, our Friends Meeting started writing letters for every execution date to the board and the governor regularly. We've missed only a few over the almost decades of doing that. And every execution date, we write a letter, and the letter it's got a template. It's got our meetings, header on it, and it's got kind of a template, but we insert facts that pertain to each individual case. And we remind the board and the governor that, quote, as early as 1699, friend John Bellers wrote, "Society has done enough for its own protection when it's rendered a murderer harmless by putting him in prison. If it does more, it's acting in a spirit of revenge." Then our meeting also, it had this prison ministry that went on for like 10 years at the federal prison in Bastrop. And that, I think, I know Glenna Balch was involved with that, Genevieve Benson. I'm thinking Liz Yates was too. I know Liz is an alternatives to violence instructor. I think she may have been doing that over there. Joanna Vaughn. I'm sure I've forgotten folks who were involved in that. It's been a while since that was going on. That sort of prison work was already established when then we started the writing letters to death row inmates, all the Texas death row inmates on the men's death row every Christmas. And we started this letter writing campaign, and then friends from the meeting started visiting people on death row. And Chip can tell us how many people are presently involved in that, but I would guess it's somewhere between 7 and 10 that regularly or irregularly go to the row to visit folks that they're corresponding with. The experience of our meeting working, we had a Quaker press conference, true thing, some time ago for Rodney Reed, back in, it was 2017. And we invited the press to treat the press conference as though it were a meeting for worship, or more like a business meeting, a Quaker business meeting. So there were periods of silence between speakers who went to the mic to talk. They would sit down and there would be a respectful silence. And then, the next person would speak. And then, sort of like that speaking and silencing was conducted throughout the press conference. And if reporters had long questions that they had for some of the presenters, they went off into rooms elsewhere in the meeting and met with them there and filmed them and so forth. It was profound. Quaker press conference. So anyway, I guess that's all I got to say at the outset, and it's longer than expected. We'd love to hear y'all's thoughts, especially those of you in the Austin meeting, and that's your experiences.
I'll share a little bit, Walter. I think that that maybe I have two friends that I write with on death row, and I haven't been doing it that long, maybe a year and a half, something like that. And I think the first thing was to find a way in my heart to forgive, or to recognize that, like somebody had said earlier, despite their past, they're still human. And they're not. And once I visited and really understood how people that are on death row are living, then it it kind of broke my heart. And Walter talked about the impact on others. I talk quite often. In fact, each time I visit one of my friends on death row, I usually will talk to his mother before or after, and often both. In fact, she just visited Gary in this last month, and that was the first time she had seen him since before COVID, that was great. And I haven't seen a letter from him since then, but that really meant a lot. But in talking to her, that really made me understand that collateral impact, in talking to her, to his mother, to Gary's mother. And I think the one other thing I'll just mention is again, it feels like even when you put the innocents, the people who are innocent yet are on death row, if you put that horrific condition aside for a moment, when I understood the living conditions, when I understood during COVID, it may be a week before they got out of their 8x10s or their cell to get a shower or to get recreation, maybe a week. And then it felt like the punishment was so extreme. What was the end game, and what was it up to the end game? So those are the things that really impacted me, just kind of random.
The first person that I knew on death row was Luis Ramirez, and I got to know him by writing, and then visited him in 2004 and 2005. And then he was executed, and I stopped going. I didn't have anything to do with the program for about 3 years because that was such a jolt to my system. And then when I began to write another person and to visit him, and then a second person, I realized that part of what sustained me was that we tend to go in a carload. Sometimes that's just two of us going from Austin to Livingston, which is 4 to 5 hours each one way, doing the 2 visits and turning around and coming back that same day. But you have a built-in support group because you're doing the same job. And sometimes we share something somebody wrote. Sometimes we share, this is the strangest request I've ever had from this guy. But it has been a sustaining thing. I also know that there have been, I don't know if at present there are, people visiting from the Houston meeting also. At visiting Texas Death Row in Livingston.
I'll speak a little bit. My name is Kevin King. I'm from Live Oak Friends meeting in Houston, and it was Joanna Vaughn's encouragement.
Kevin, I can barely hear you.
Thank you, Walter.
Sure.
Is that better?
That's great.
I'm Kevin King from Live Oak Friends meeting in Houston. It was Joanna Vaughn's encouragement and contact that I started writing Cedric Ricks a number of years ago. But I'm sad to say that I've fallen away from it, and this is reviving my interest in doing that. I did get into the AVP program at Bastrop State Prison in Texas that we revived in February, just before the pandemic in 2020, before the prison got closed. And it was with the help of Glenna Balch and Liz Yates, who'd been in there 20 years prior when the program was active. And I think we're quite welcome to go back. Of course, the participants were just ecstatic. But part of why I stopped sending money to Cedric Ricks was, as a volunteer going into to AVP, I was discouraged by the prison from giving money as if I wanted to stay on the volunteer list. So it was a dilemma. One thing that has affected me was I've fallen away from this too, but from about 6 to about 4 years ago, I was active in attending the public events that the Restorative Justice Collaborative of Houston had, and its main participants were teachers in the education systems in Houston. But since exposure to them, it's like I've put the ideas together that we could do so much better with our society at trying to make right the wrongs that some individuals do that take responsibility for it, and have healing and growth and a thriving community, rather than this legal system designed for retribution. And I really like the quote that you started with, Walter, on the state-sponsored revenge. It's through friends at the Friends meeting of Austin that got me started with Alternatives to Violence Project, and I've made some deep connections with some returning citizens, and the brief trip into the Bastrop, and I can't wait till we can get the program approved. They've got a different way to authorize that kind of program, and I'm watching the application as best I can so that we can get back in there when it gets approved.
Sounds like somebody's got something going on. Or maybe that's you, Kevin. Something going on in the background?
No, there's another participant whose microphone, it becomes noisy, and I've muted them again.
Okay. I might respond to just a few of these things, and we could quickly, with regard to what Chip was saying about collateral impact. I often almost bristle at the word collateral because if you look at the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual about post-traumatic stress disorder, a direct trigger of traumatic stress is the threat to someone who someone has in their care or who cares about. It's like you're not a direct you're directly affected by trauma if you are the mother of a death row inmate, if you're a defense attorney representing a death row inmate. I would say even if you're a prosecutor trying to kill an inmate, you're directly affected by trauma. Collateral damage is like the kind of damage that folks get when they listen to stories about others' traumas, like therapists listening to the story of someone telling them about an execution. And so I think I'm not definitely not criticizing you, Kevin, no, it wasn't Kevin, it was Chip for using the word, but it's so commonly used and it's inaccurate, it's wrong. There's a lot of direct damage being done to everyone who's involved in this. And Texas After Violence Project has set up a training program, which we're calling our Access to Treatment program, for therapists around the state to learn how to work with death row inmates' families in particular, to learn about the specific kinds of damage done to them, which various forms of complicated grief, anticipatory grief, as a await possible execution of a loved one, disenfranchised grief, because they're like sometimes felt on a much like more trivial level when I was in churches and people didn't understand what I was doing. Death row family members include, and also murder victims similarly have the same experience of disenfranchised grief, that people just can't understand the enormity of what they've been through, and they sense that. One of the reasons we're doing training with therapists is so the training, many times, like we've heard from family members that they tried therapy, they went into a therapist, they told their story, the therapist broke down crying, couldn't handle it. So we're preparing therapists so they're ready to work with family members who have a need, and they can do that with virtual therapy with anyone in the state wherever they're living. And the Austin YWCA has gone through the training. There's a bunch of therapists there that are ready to receive people. Capital Area Counseling is going through training. We've got a bunch of, not a bunch, but several local independent therapists have their own offices who are also now ready to receive family members. So there's that. Also, I was just thinking about what Kevin said about the terms state-sponsored revenge, and just wanted to point out the anomaly that is death penalty law. There's no other form of law that has as its chief aim the annihilation of a helpless human being. In fact, there's no other law that's designed to kill. Military law is designed to ameliorate the damage of wars that have already started. Death penalty law is the only law that is designed to kill, and I would submit it isn't law. And I sometimes think that what I do is, just participate in a system of administrative regulation of state homicide. And I think what law is the nonviolent resolution of human conflicts through words, in an authoritative setting with a decision maker who can respond to the dispute with a decision.
I am a member of the Dallas Friends meeting. And what you said, what you talked about just a minute ago, Walter, resonated with me. Before becoming a Quaker, I didn't give a lot of thought to the death penalty. I thought that there were people who were capable in law enforcement and attorneys and those kinds of people who made sure that the person who committed a crime was punished for that crime, and didn't give a whole bunch of thought to whether that person was innocent or guilty or whatever. But one of the things that I participated in when I became a Quaker was the Christmas card thing, where we were invited to, there's a professor at SMU that leads a group of people that work towards that. And I'm sitting in a room full of people, and some of them are Quakers and some of them are just people, and I didn't realize that who everybody was in the room. So the person that I'm sitting next to is the father of one of the people that we were doing the cards for. His son is on death row and has been for quite a while. And we had a very in-depth conversation about not only is the person who is convicted of committing the crime punished, but everybody associated with that person is also punished. They are punished by society. They are treated as less than human when they go to visit. All of these things are taken from the person who was convicted of a crime, whether they were innocent or guilty, but the family is also convicted. And we as a society don't think about it. We don't understand it. And in training to be a counselor, and I'd love to be a part of the program where you teach therapists about the effects of the death penalty. One of the things that we looked at was the death penalty, and the unfairness and the injustice associated with putting a human being to death without knowing or caring if that person is truly guilty or innocent. It's just to annihilate another human being. The state of Texas, there were a lot of places throughout the United States started to look at the death penalty, and some changes were made in order to get rid of the death penalty. And there were they looked at the laws of parameters around the death penalty, and one of the parameters that they looked at was intelligence, IQ. There's a state set standard of what a person's IQ has to be for them to be declared, what is it? I'm at a loss for the word.
Intellectually disabled.
Intellectually disabled. The state has a standard for that. Texas decided that it did not matter what your IQ was, that they would, if you were found guilty, that you would be killed too. Persons who were not, if they were looked at from a mental health perspective, they could not be held responsible for their actions. But the state of Texas said they did not care. I didn't understand the depth of, and I think it's just not caring about human beings when it comes to the criminal justice system. And that was an eye opener for me, because it never occurred to me that the criminal justice system was in fact very unjust and very punishing. So, but when you talked about the Christmas card thing, that brought all of that back to me.
Well, the criminal justice system is rooted in the theology and the philosophy that was around the theology at the time it came out of Calvinism, and human sinfulness and disobedience to higher authority, and the right of higher authority to punish. And you know, before the Enlightenment, the kinds of punishments that were inflicted were horrible, you know, drawing and quartering, you know, and all kinds of horrible, horrible things in addition to executions. And we're still weaning ourselves from that. We still have the vestiges, many of the vestiges, actually the presence, the full presence of the sort of sadistic ideology behind punishment. And it penetrates our criminal justice system. It's not just the death penalty, but it's the idea of punishment. I just wanted to let you know, Amita, that I put in the chat the link to the Texas After Violence Project's Access to Treatment program. And anybody who would like to communicate with me later, including yourself, you know, my email is just waltlong@aol.com. Just remember, dinosaur email program, and my name without the ER on my first name, waltlong@aol.com. And I'll be glad to bestow you with many other resources. Yeah.
Because I now work with incarcerated, in treatment for incarcerated individuals. So all of this, everything that you're talking about today just brings all of the injustice, how people are housed, how people are treated. It just brings all of that back.
Well, interesting that you point that out, because I've also developed in my perspective on the death penalty, the idea that it's essentially a public health problem. And the way that it's a public health problem is that it is, to use the terms of child psychiatry, it's a trauma organized system, you know, with a very authoritative and capricious father figure at the top, committing abuse. The family members are essentially defenseless. Either the defensors, the persons who would defend them, are absent or have been neutralized. And the system itself doesn't know, you know, it's like, as many abusive families they're not aware of the abuse. You know, they're under the sway of a powerful figure at the top, and they're dissociated. They're in denial, they're avoidant, and they're just living through this situation without realizing it. That's our culture. That's our retributive culture. And that is the way of looking at the death penalty, I think, and it ties into my original comments about feminism. Death penalty is the spearhead of patriarchy.
I'm Alex McDonald at Live Oak in Houston, and although I have not written or visited any inmates, one thing I'm reminded of, a friend who was the clerk of my membership committee, Burnham Terrell, and he was very active in this whole death penalty issue, and every time there was someone who was going to be put to death by the state, he would share it in meeting for worship, in the announcements, and he would always say, "Our brother, Joe Smith, whatever, will be put to death by the state of Texas this Wednesday," or whatever. And he would always say, "Please hold him, his family, the victims' families in the light." And then there was always a protest at a Catholic church in town. But him calling the person in prison our brother always humanized the connection for me of of the person that we were putting to death. And I think that was very helpful and touching to me. And I'm thinking, thank you, Walter, for having this today, because I'm thinking maybe that's a good thing for us to bring back to our meeting. Thank you.
When
Alex, in the sorry.
when the prison system in Arkansas brings you together to give you an informational afternoon or evening, something that they want you to go through to get this little badge before you start doing AVP in the prisons, which we started about 7 years ago in a prison right outside of Little Rock. They make it quite a point of how prisons were developed in this country, and they readily give Quakers the credit for the so-called first prison, real prison in the country. And subsequently, they don't really have that much to stand behind that when they talk about it. It's sort of in passing, or let me say that the first real prisons, worthwhile prisons of brick and stone, were brought about by the Quakers, who at the time saw it as a way of reforming the prison system, I'm sure, in some way. But they don't spend a lot of time on the details. Walter, has that been your experience too, or you probably know a lot more about that than I do?
Well, the Quaker prison was one model, and then New York had that was in Pennsylvania, and New York had another model. And in the early years of prisons, and the New York model was the chain gang model, and people could let out in the community to work while they were in prison, albeit in chains. And the Quaker Pennsylvania model was the solitary confinement model, and folks went crazy in that one. And interestingly, Quakers believed that people were good, and so they could find their way back to God in their solitary confinement spaces. And the New Yorkers believed people were bad, and they had to be chained and they had to be worked.
Right, they did mention that the Reformation improvement was possible, and that it was worthwhile trying to do something, even if it was minimal, with inmates while they were being imprisoned. We had a couple of years ago an inmate. He was in for life. He was sentenced to spending the rest of his time in prison in solitary confinement. So he was he had murdered a fellow inmate. He was fully ready to take responsibility for that, et cetera, et cetera. But he became a member of the Religious Society of Friends in his last couple of years. And that was quite a moving experience, actually. He was very resolute about that, and very adult-like, which you would expect, but it was still a surprise.
Well, I wanted to respond to Alex, and also I just posted another thing, which is hopefully you all can see in the chat. It's a UN book called Death Penalty and the Victims. It came out in 2016. And I have a chapter in the book toward the end that's on the death penalty as a public health problem. And the book takes the extraordinary view, I'd say for the UN at any rate, it's never spoken about this to my knowledge before in this way. It takes the extraordinary view that essentially everyone who's involved in death penalty cases is a victim. So there are chapters on all the different kinds of stakeholders in cases throughout the book. And my colleague, Susanna Sheffer, who leads the Access to Treatment Program for Texas Active Violence Project, has a couple of chapters in there as well. I kind of wanted to read a short essay that I wrote to close the meeting, I think, which we're closing in about 10 minutes. Would that be okay with people if I do that? It's sort of on the subject matter of, I suppose, of spirit and the death penalty.
I've been trying to get my word in edgewise for a couple of minutes here now.
Go for it.
The solitary confinement, administrative segregation, EdSeg is itself a violation of human dignity and pushes human sanity. It's illegal in many parts of the world, but that doesn't stop the state of Texas and many other places from using it. Besides 2 people on death row, I have a third pen pal who has been in administrative segregation, i.e. solitary, for over 10 years. As long as we use that kind of system, there's no way these people can have a chance to operate as sane human beings and stay sane.
It looks like somebody accidentally closed the breakout rooms.
Yeah, the breakout room's going to close in about 50 seconds. I want to say one thing in response to Mary in the chat. I just posted something about the end of isolation tour, which John is coming to Arkansas, as well as to Austin. Austin performances are going to be July 15th to 17th at Holy Cross Catholic Church. The Friends Meeting of Austin is going to house the performers that are working on this tour. It's about ending solitary confinement in the United States.
So it would be in Arkansas probably after Texas, you think?
Yes, it will be, because Texas is the first one.
Thank you.
We can come back to this room after they get recreated. Sorry for the disruption.
Kevin?
Somebody
Yeah, somebody ended the,
We
somebody
ended about 10 minutes
hit the
early,
clo-
folks.
yeah.
somebody must have hit the button that said close breakout rooms.
Well, if you want to continue here, please go right on.
Well, no, this is the lobby. So let's everyone go back to the death penalty breakout room.
Yeah, hang on a second. Let me, because it just popped up here.
That. Okay, we're back for about 8 minutes, I guess, or no, less than that, 7. So End of Isolation Tour, it's a play about solitary confinement called The Box. It's excellent. You know, it's designed to help us all work through the problem of retributive justice in the United States and different manifestation than the death penalty, but not in Texas where the two are joined. Can I read that story? Okay. It's called Proof of God. When Fred Allen went home after killing Carla Faye Tucker, my client, he began to reflect on how kind she had been to him during her last moments, telling him, her executioner, without irony, that she appreciated him. Fred recounted that he found himself alone in the workshop behind his house with the memory of her compassionate umber eyes set in pale white skin, surrounded by an unruly mane of black curls, just looking at him. Not angry, not afraid, just taking him in before they turned vacant. And Fred began to shake uncontrollably, and suddenly he found himself confronted with the faces of all the men he had killed over the years, their eyes also connecting with his eyes. In that moment, Fred vowed to himself no more. He would not take the life of another human being. When Carla was killed, I was standing alone at the fax in the office building I shared with one of her other attorneys, staring vacantly out the window at the graying asphalt of our parking lot, some few minutes after the sun had removed itself and long shadows had vanished. Someone had just called from Australia to ask how she was. She was dead. For several days, I had manned the office. I could not go to the prison. I could not say goodbye to her, but my colleagues had brought back a note that she had written to me that she had told them was a final gift. So now I unfolded the slip of paper. All she had scribbled was 1 Corinthians 15:53. I pulled out my Bible. I read 1 Corinthians chapter 15:53. For the perishable must clothe itself with the imperishable and the mortal with immortality. I don't know how else to say it. My heart sank. Why? Because my client was a fighter, because she loved this life. She wanted to continue to live this life. She transformed her own story from association with a terrifying bloody crime to public association with sainthood. So successfully rehabilitated was she that for many years, scores of anguished free world souls flocked to death row to see her and receive her advice and encouragement. Slight of frame, gentle of mien, she was as fiercely protective of them as a mother mockingbird. Unlike the many famous and not so famous evangelists who recast her success story to profit their own otherworldly gospel, she didn't look upon soul saving as simple preparation for immortality. No, she sought to meet the soul in the other in order to help it be born into this life, through acceptance of itself, through reconciliation with others. When Carla met Fred on her last day, she reached him in a deep place, showed him this life, and he embraced it. I don't know if that's proof of God, but I believe I can show you what's not. The reasons offered for killing a human being are arguments against God, and there is no act that speaks more eloquently of the universal muteness and absence of the divine than murder. Public or private actors who commit intentional homicide are practical atheists, such was George Bush when he chose to ignore that the only legal basis for Carla's death sentence, that she had been predicted to be a danger to others, had been bulldozed away by her beckoned benign behavior in prison. In a dramatic press announcement issued a short while before I stood at the fact staring out the window, Bush informed the world that he chose not to exercise his clemency power. Like many touched by this case, I have sought guidance through prayer, he said. I have concluded judgment about the heart and soul of an individual on death row is best left to a higher authority. He added, God bless Carla Faye. And then, without any regard for her singular opportunity at this life, which he held in his hands, he punted the decision before him to the higher authority of his own imagining. Days later, I unfolded the scrap of paper on which Carla had sent me her final message. I discovered that I had misread it. What I had seen as a 3 was an 8, actually 1 Corinthians 15:58. To my rising delight, this was a diametrically different message. Therefore, my dear brothers and sisters, stand firm. Let nothing move you. Always give yourselves fully to the work of the Lord, because you know that your labor in the Lord is not in vain. She'd not given up. She'd not capitulated to the forces that would kill her. She was still at work within me, and the work of the Lord. What could that be? Might it be, with winnowing fork in hand, a brisk clearing of the threshing floor? Might it be rooting out the places where Moloch hides in all of our temples? Might it be the stubborn pursuit of healing and connection, even on the days when someone else's God forbids it? I read that kind of quick. I didn't know that I'd have enough time.
Thank you, Walter. Right.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's powerful.
Yeah, well, it illustrates that even the, or maybe even principally, the executioners are just as damaged as the rest of us. Maybe everybody's afraid to say anything because we're going to be cut off in any second.
This room will stay open as long as people are here.
But we're going to be ushered back into the other meeting at this point now, though, right?
No, there's no plan to
Oh,
end the
okay.
meeting. What happened before was a mistake on the part of somebody with the power to press those buttons.
Well, I'm sorry I read that so fast. But anyway, maybe it's still all right.
When you mentioned the absurdity of whether or not to stay a person's execution who is factually innocent, my mind kind of went to, and it's not the same situation really, but so I'm not sure why my mind went there, to Oklahoma's Richard Glossop, who didn't kill anyone, and the prosecution knows he didn't kill anyone, and he wasn't tried for killing. and he's on death row for because the guy who did kill Barry Van Treese, and I think Barry Van Treese's name should be mentioned in this discussion. The guy who actually did kill him said that Richard Glossop put him up to it. So that, and I find an absurdity about that the guy who killed him got a life sentence, and the guy who didn't kill him is on death row. So I think it's not the exact same situation, but also absurd, I think.
Yeah, and in some death penalty cases, the state of Texas has argued in one trial that between two co-defendants, one was the shooter and the other the non-shooter, and then in a subsequent trial, the one that it argued was the non-shooter in the first trial, they are argued was the shooter, and the other was the non-shooter. And you know, it just gets, I think this brings me back to the legalization of revenge. You know, somebody's got to pay. I had a case that went on for 20 years of a guy who was an accomplice to something. There was a murder. 2 people were killed and 1 survived really horrible wounds. There were 3 people that were alleged to be perpetrators, and it's unclear what role my client had, but if any, in the actual murder. And the state and everyone agreed that the actual murderer was killed on the night of the offense by the police. Yet the state pursued my client for 20 years with it unclear what he did or where he was in order to kill him, because it cut a deal with the other co-defendant for life, you know, in return for his possible cooperation, a life sentence. He never cooperated, but he got the life sentence, and my client was exposed to death. And the state tried him twice, actually, because there were 2 murders, 2 people who were actually killed. So it went after him twice, 2 different trials, getting convictions twice in order to kill him. And he ultimately died on the row from liver cancer after quite a long struggle. And I was with him for 20 years, and I was with him in the prison hospital in Galveston. And it's really nothing quite as absurd as Melissa Lucio's case. You know, somebody's got to die for a kid that died. And there's hardly any evidence that the crime occurred, much less evidence that she's responsible for a possible crime that might have happened. And yet she's looking at an execution date on April 27th.
This man I mentioned who had murdered an inmate in the prison, that's how he felt. He knew he had to die. Well, that wasn't the only reason, as it turned out, but yeah, he was very cool and well-spoken about that aspect of his own situation.
You mean that he felt that he himself needed to die because of what he had done, or?
Yes, that's correct. Yeah.
He felt the responsibility for it.
Yeah, he often talked about, I want to be held accountable, and in this manner, I'm going to be held accountable. yeah. Well, I'm passing this on to other people. He was moved around in prisons and wasn't always close to us, but other people in the Texas, Arkansas configuration of states, they actually did visit him and got to know him personally. I'm telling you things that he was a prolific writer. He loved stationery and correspondence. So he would write and tell these things, or people would tell stories about him, especially as he grew older and ultimately became ill, and he died of an illness before his execution.
When I mentioned earlier that my own personal critique of the death penalty, I don't perhaps consider it to be law. In capital punishment, death penalty, or in death penalty law, there's this idea called finality, which is, essentially that punishment has to take place at some point. And so there can't be endless delays of an execution. There's got to be a stopping point, so that the state can carry out what it's required to do under the law, which is designed to kill. And that's why I think it has actually nothing to do with law, because the law, in order to accurately resolve disputes, to find facts, it always needs time. It always needs more time. And these processes of finality work in other areas of the law, but they're not lethal in the way that they are in death penalty cases. And I think the most salient and moving Supreme Court case that I've encountered in my practice was a 1990 case. It was a 3-page opinion and dissent from denial of a stay in Wilbert Evans' case, Virginia death penalty case. The dissent was written by Thurgood Marshall. And what had happened in the case was, sometime before the execution date was set, there'd been a prison riot at death row, the Mecklenburg prison in Virginia. And Wilbert Evans had saved several prison guards, their lives. It saved the lives of several prison guards from the rioting other prisoners.
Just let him finish.
And so when the execution date was set, he challenged the correctness of it, observing that Virginia law, just like Texas law, requires that a person be proven to always pose a risk of danger to others in order to qualify to be executed. The future dangerousness proof. And he said that in his case, future dangerousness had been conclusively disproven because he'd actually saved the lives of these guards who were, supporting his petition with affidavits and asking that he be spared. The state said, well, if we were to, he didn't have any legal argument, just practical sort of arguments, that if we were to allow this kind of late blooming evidence of somebody's, lack of qualification to be executed, to rise at such a late date in a case, there'd be so many of these claims that the system would be flooded, the courthouses would be, the operations of the law would be slowed and nothing would get done. And so the US Supreme Court, the majority of justices agreed with that. And Marshall dissented, and he said that, if conclusive evidence arises, even at the latest stage of a case, that a person set for execution is not in fact, that execution is not in fact appropriate, and should evidence arises that it's not appropriate in the case, it it should not be the inmate. You know, if our system can't contain that, can't allow for such late blooming evidence to come forth that can save a person's life, then it's not the life of the prisoner that that should be taken, but the system itself should be dispatched, he said. And essentially that, and so Evans was executed and asked for Marshall's dissenting opinion to be buried with him. And that's our death penalty. Designed to kill, does what it's supposed to do, and devastates justice in the process and humanity.
Wow.
It's a shame that we live in a country where it's easier to kill a human being than it is to admit to flawed laws.
Regular occurrence.
Hi, Kevin. Thank you. I've got to leave. Thank you all. Thanks, Walter.
Thanks, Walter.
Nice to see you, John.
Thanks, Walter. Good night.
Sure. Good night. Night, Alex.
Thanks for your time. Yeah.
Thank you for the information.
You bet.
Yeah, thank you.